My hand didn't shake when I signed it. That's the part they never expected. 3 weeks out of the hospital, supposedly still foggy from the stroke, and my hand moved across that deed transfer as steady as it ever had behind a plow. Diane was watching me the way you watch a sick dog, waiting to see if it's going to fall over. Garrett stood by the kitchen window with his back half turned, pretending to look at the east field, but I could see his reflection in the glass. He was smiling. I signed my name Earl Thomas Hartley, in the same unhurried cursive my father had taught me at this very table when I was 9 years old. I set the pen down, and then I looked at my daughter, and I smiled back. Not the smile of a man who's been beaten, not the tired smile of a 67-year-old widower still learning how to sleep alone. The kind of smile that comes from knowing something the other people in the room don't. But I'll tell you what that smile cost me. Because I've never said it out loud to anyone. For just a moment, with the pen still warm in my hand, I looked at the empty chair across the table. Ruth's chair. Nobody had sat in it for 16 months because I couldn't bring myself to move it or to use it. And something came up out of my chest so fast and so hard that I nearly lost the whole thing right there. Not anger. Anger I could have managed. This was grief, raw as an open furrow, and underneath it a single unbearable question. How did it come to this, that my own girl would sit at her mother's table and try to take the ground out from under me, while I was still learning how to breathe without my wife in the house? I put it back down. I had to. A man can only carry one thing at a time and do it well, and what I had to carry that afternoon was not my grief. There would be time for grief later. This was not it. So I smiled, and Diane's expression flickered, and then she smoothed it over and reached across the table to take the document. "This is the right thing, Dad," she said. "You can't work 160 acres alone anymore. Not after what happened." What happened? That's what she called it. A man collapses alone in his own field. Spends 4 days in Cedar County Memorial with a machine beeping out the rhythm of his damaged heart. And his daughter calls it what happened. Like a weather event. Like something nobody caused. Garrett turned from the window. He was wearing a pressed collared shirt I'd never seen before. The kind of thing a man wears when he wants to be taken seriously. 44 years old. 16 years married to my daughter. And he had never once learned how to look me in the eye without something calculating moving behind his own. "The Cardinal Ridge offer won't stay on the table forever. Earl," he said. He used my first name like a tool, like familiarity was something he could deploy when it served him. "Bram Foley's been patient. If we don't close this week—" "I know how fast development moves," I said. He paused. I don't think he expected me to finish a sentence that cleanly. I looked down at the paper. 160 acres. The same ground my great-grandfather broke with a team of horses before the First World War. The ground where my father taught me what work meant, and what it meant to tend something that would outlast you. The ground where Ruth and I had buried 3 dogs and nearly lost everything the year soybean prices dropped out. The ground I had just signed over to a man who didn't know the difference between topsoil and subsoil, and didn't care to learn. "Your grandmother used to say the land remembers," I said. She meant it literally. Said you could read where the old fence rows were just by watching what grew up along them in spring. Said the ground holds things, memories, intentions. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. I used to think that was just old woman talk. I don't anymore. "You'll have the proceeds," Garrett said. "Real money, Earl. Life-changing money. Diane and I will make sure you're taken care of." taken care of. I turned that phrase over the way you turn a stone to see what's living under it. I stood up slowly, because my left side still wasn't entirely trustworthy, and I wouldn't give Garrett the satisfaction of watching me rush. I straightened to my full height, still 6'1", still enough to make most men in Cedar County take a small step backward.
Garrett did not step backward.
I'll give him that. "There's something you both need to understand," I said. I looked at Diane first, as she was my daughter, and because some part of me still believed what lived in her was worth addressing directly. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator and a tractor somewhere on the Mueller place next door. 4 generations of Hartleys had listened to that same sound. I found it comforting now.
"I signed that paper," I said. "You both watched me do it. Sit with that feeling for a moment, because it's about to change."
Diane looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at me. "The land you just sold," I said, "isn't yours to sell." The refrigerator hummed. My daughter's face did something I didn't have a name for. Garrett's jaw tightened in the way of a man who's heard something he doesn't yet understand, but already knows he doesn't like. "What does that mean?" Diane said. "Careful. Controlled." I picked up my coffee cup again, more out of habit than need. Some habits run deeper than heartbreak. "It means your mother had something to say about this ground," I said. "She said it a long time ago, quietly, where nobody thought to look." I set the cup down. "And it's going to change everything you think happened today." 3 weeks earlier, I had been alone in the East Field when my body quit on me. There was no warning worth mentioning. One moment I was walking the fence line along the creek bottom, checking where the wire had gone slack after the last hard rain. And the next, I was on my knees in the mud with the whole left side of my face gone strange and numb. The sky was the pale gray of early November. The soybean stalks stood cut and brittle around me. I remember thinking, very clearly, that Ruth would have hated for me to be found like this, face down in the dirt, alone, no better than a sick animal crawling off into the brush. I didn't fall all the way. I got my right hand down and kept myself from going flat. And I stayed there breathing, waiting to see if it was going to pass or going to finish me. A red-tailed hawk circled once over the south pasture and moved on. The ground under me was cold and damp, and I pressed my palm flat against it the way a man does when he needs to feel something solid, something that has been there longer than his trouble and will be there long after. It didn't pass. Hank Mueller found me 40 minutes later. He'd seen my truck at the field gate and pulled in, because nobody in their right mind lets a 67-year-old widower wander 160 acres alone. Hank was 70 himself, with bad knees, and still crossed that field faster than a man his age had any right to. There are people whose loyalty you don't earn and don't deserve. You simply receive it, and Hank is one of them. He didn't say much when he found me, just got his arm under mine and said, "All right, Earl, I got you." That was enough. Cedar County Memorial kept me 4 days. Ischemic stroke, they said. Moderate. Left side weakness. Some speech hesitation that cleared by the second day. Fatigue that would linger for weeks. They talked about stress and diet and the importance of not living alone on a farm at my age. I nodded and thought about the east fence line I hadn't finished checking. Diane came the first evening and said the right things. Garrett came the second day, briefly, and spent most of his time in the hallway on his phone. It was the third night that I heard them. The room was dark, and I'd been drifting when voices carried down the corridor, louder than they realized. I caught pieces, something about timing, something about the offer, And then Garrett's voice sharpened, and I heard the number clearly. The number Cardinal Ridge Development had put on 4 generations of Hartley ground. I lay still and listened to my son-in-law describe my land as a problem that had finally become solvable. Diane said something I couldn't make out. Garrett's answer carried through. With the power of attorney, he said, they could move quickly. The stroke had done them a favor in terms of timing. By the time I was back on my feet, the deed would already be transferred, and there wouldn't be much point in an old man fighting what was already done. By the time I was back on my feet, I closed my eyes. The monitor beeped its slow rhythm. I thought about Ruth, who had died in a room not unlike this one, 16 months before. I thought about the steadiness in her eyes near the end. The quiet certainty of a woman who had decided something important and would not be talked out of it. There had been moments when I'd wanted to ask her what she was thinking. I hadn't. I carried that now the way you carry a stone in your chest, heavier some mornings than others. I thought about Diane at 7 years old, following me down the crop rows with her boots on the wrong feet because she'd dressed herself and refused any help. She used to wait by the gate every evening for my truck to come up the lane, and she'd run the last 30 yards to meet me like I'd been gone a year instead of a day. I don't know exactly when she stopped running to the gate. That's the cruel thing about distance between a parent and a child. It never arrives all at once. It accumulates, one unanswered evening at a time. Until one day you look up, and there's a grown woman across the table who looks at you like a stranger. And you cannot for the life of you point to the moment it happened. I had let that distance stand for years, telling myself it would resolve the way weather resolves. It hadn't. That was a failure I owned entirely. But Ruth's eyes, the deliberateness behind them. Ruth had never made a decision she hadn't thought 3 steps further than everyone else. Whatever she had done with that land, she had done on purpose, and she had done it for all of us, even the ones who didn't know they needed protecting. So I lay in that bed and made a decision of my own. I would go home. I would let them believe I was diminished. I would be the slow old man who leaned on the counter when he thought nobody was watching. And I would let them feel the ground shifting in the comfortable direction. But there was one thing I didn't understand yet, lying there in the dark. And it nagged at me like a splinter you can feel but can't find. Garrett wasn't talking like a greedy man. I'd known greedy men. Greed is patient. Greed can wait for the right price. Garrett's voice had something else underneath it that night. Something tighter. The sound of a man who isn't reaching for more, but running from something that's already gaining on him. I didn't know yet what was chasing my son-in-law, but I was going to find out. And what I found would turn out to be worse than greed. And it would not be his secret to keep much longer. Diane set her coffee cup down very carefully, the way people do when they need their hands to be doing something other than shaking. "What does that mean, Dad?" she said again. Same words as before, but the careful control had shifted, the way ice shifts when something moves underneath it. Garrett had pushed off from the window frame and stood fully upright now, both feet planted, hands loose at his sides in the posture of a man who has decided he may need to argue his way out of something. I didn't answer right away. I've learned over the years that silence is a tool most people don't know how to use. They fill it up with words before it has a chance to do its work. Garrett was already drawing breath when I turned and walked to the hallway. The file was where I'd left it. 3rd drawer of the oak dresser my father bought at an estate sale in 1962, under 3 years of farm insurance papers. A plain manila folder, the kind of thing a man accumulates without thinking over 40 years of running a place. I carried it back and set it on the table between us. Nobody spoke. "Sit down," I said, Not unkindly, but clearly.
Garrett didn't sit. Diane did. Slowly. The way a person lowers herself onto a surface she isn't sure will hold. Bram Foley, who'd been standing near the back door with his hands in his coat pockets, in the manner of a man who'd rather not be held responsible for whatever was about to happen, took a small step back and said nothing. I opened the folder. The first page was a copy of the power of attorney, the one they'd used to authorize the transfer while I was in the hospital. I smoothed it flat with my palm, took the pen from my shirt pocket, and set the tip beside the signature at the bottom. That's supposed to be my name, I said. And here is the thing I didn't expect to feel. Looking down at that forged signature on my own kitchen table. I had sat at this exact table 40 years ago with Diane on my knee, her small hand wrapped around a fat pencil. The two of us working through the letters of her name over and over on the back of a seed catalog. D-I-A-N-E. She'd been so proud the first time she got the whole thing without help that she'd run out to the barn to show her mother. And now here was her grown hand, or her husband's, forging my name at the same table where I had taught her how to write her own. Something in my chest pulled tight and ugly. I let it pull. Then I kept talking, because the work in front of me was not yet done. It's a good copy, I said. Whoever did it practiced. The H curl's a little different than mine, but you'd have to be looking. I held the page up to the kitchen light. What's harder to fake is the pressure. Since I hurt my wrist a few years back, I favor the outside of my grip. Makes one side of the downstroke heavier. This signature's even all the way through. Even as a printing press. I set it down. A man's hand doesn't write that evenly. A careful forger's does. The kitchen was quiet enough to hear Foley breathing through his nose. Earl, Garrett said. That document was witnessed and notarized. Any concerns about the process should go through proper. They already have, I said. The recorder's office has copies. So does an attorney you'll meet in about a minute. I closed the folder but left it on the table. I'm not raising a question, Garrett. I'm showing you the answer to one. Diane was looking at the signature now, and something was moving across her face. She couldn't quite put down. Not guilt. Not yet. More like the first cold recognition that the floor she'd been standing on had a basement she'd never checked. I had watched that face her whole life. I knew its weather. There are 3 more pages in here, I said, quieter now, mostly to her. Each with the same problem. Together they make what a court calls a pattern. I'm not telling you that to frighten you, Diane. I'm telling you so you understand what we're actually sitting in this kitchen talking about. For a second, I thought she might say something true. Her mouth opened. Then Foley cleared his throat, and whatever it was went back wherever it had come from. Mr. Hartley, he said. Cardinal Ridge engaged in good faith, and our position. I understand your position, I said. You'll have a chance to explain it to Marian Ellsworth. She's a good deal more interested in it than I am. Who is Marian Ellsworth? Diane asked. Before I could answer, 3 knocks landed on the front door. Not a neighbor's knock. Not the loose, casual rap of someone dropping off a casserole or returning a borrowed tool. These were measured and unhurried. The knocks of someone who was expected, who had knocked on a great many doors in her life and learned that the way you knock tells people something about what you're carrying on the other side. I looked at Diane. That, I said, is Marian Ellsworth. I walked to the door without hurrying. Behind me, I heard Garrett murmur something to Foley, too low to catch. I heard Diane's chair scrape back. I heard the refrigerator and the Mueller boys' tractor, faint and steady,
indifferent to everything happening inside this house. I opened the door. Marion Ellsworth was 68 years old, 5'4", and carried the kind of still, deliberate presence you feel before you've finished registering it. She'd been Ruth's attorney before she was mine, and she had driven 2 hours from Des Moines on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked twice. The leather bag on her shoulder held, among other things, a sealed envelope Ruth had prepared 4 years before she died. She looked at me. Something passed between us that needed no words. "Earl," she said. "Marion," I said. "Come in." Marion Ellsworth did not look around when she came in. She had been in this kitchen before, years ago, with Ruth, for reasons I had never fully been told. Whatever was said between them, both women had kept it, and now I understood why. Marion set her leather bag on the counter, unzipped it with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and lifted out a document bound with a blue cover sheet and a gold-embossed notary seal. She carried it to the table and set it down in front of Garrett. Not in front of me, in front of him. "My name is Marion Ellsworth," she said. "I represent the estate of Ruth Ann Hartley, and I'm also legal counsel for Prairie Heritage Land Trust." She pulled out the chair I'd vacated and sat down, folding her hands on the table with the unhurried manner of someone who had all the time in the world. "What I'm placing in front of you is a certified copy of a conservation easement covering the 160 acres of Hartley Farm. The original was signed by Ruth 4 years ago, recorded with the county recorder, and has been in full legal force since that date." The kitchen held its breath. "A conservation easement," Marion said, her voice precise as a well-set fence post, "is permanent. It restricts this property from any development or subdivision in perpetuity. It does not expire when the owner dies, does not transfer with a deed, and cannot be dissolved by any subsequent sale." She paused. "Including the one executed in this kitchen this afternoon." I watched Garrett's face. There are moments in a man's life when you see the thing underneath the thing, when the surface a person has spent years constructing shows you, just briefly, what the foundation is actually made of. His jaw didn't drop. He was too controlled for that. But the color went out of him in a way that no act of will could have prevented, draining down from his face the way water drains from low ground after a hard rain. Diane had gone very still. "I'd like to confirm," Marion said, and took her phone from the table, pressing the speaker button, "that Mr. Dale Brennan, Executive Director of Prairie Heritage Land Trust, is available." A man's voice came through clearly. "I'm here, Marion." "Mr. Brennan, can you confirm for those present the current status of the easement on the Hartley property?" "Happy to." His voice was steady, the voice of a man who dealt in the long view. Prairie Heritage Land Trust holds a perpetual conservation easement on Hartley Farm in Cedar County. Ruth Ann Hartley conveyed it in full compliance with Iowa law. The land can be farmed. It cannot be developed or subdivided. Any deed transfer purporting to convey it for development would be unenforceable against the easement. "Thank you, Dale," Marion said, and ended the call. The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cloud moved off the sun, and the November light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a long, pale stripe. It caught the gold seal on the document and made it glow. Foley spoke first. "I'll need to contact Cardinal Ridge's legal team." He was already reaching for his coat, managing his feelings with the efficiency of a man whose transactions sometimes ended this way. "We engaged in good faith," he said, more to the air than anyone specific. He moved toward the back door. I didn't try to stop him. He hadn't done the worst thing in this room today. He'd just done business with people who had. That left Garrett. He had been staring at the document since Foley left. Not reading it, his eyes weren't moving, just staring at the cover sheet. The way a man stares at a wall when his brain has gone somewhere his body can't follow. Diane was watching him. I was watching him. Marion was watching him with the particular quality of attention that attorneys develop somewhere around year 15 of practice. Not cold, but very, very patient. "This isn't," Garrett started. He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes for just a moment. And when he opened them, something had changed in his face. The architecture was still there, the jaw, the pressed collar, the 44-year-old confidence. But the room inside had rearranged. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand precisely what's been done," Marion said. "Ruth understood it too. I needed—" He stopped again. His voice had dropped half an octave. He looked at me, and for the first time in 16 years of marriage to my daughter, I saw something in Garrett Voss's face that was not performance. It was fear. "You don't know what I needed that money for." He stopped himself there, jaw clamping shut, and turned toward the window. The room held that sentence like a field holds standing water after a flood, nowhere for it to go. No way to take it back. I looked at Diane. She was looking at her husband. Whatever she was thinking moved across her face in a way she wasn't trying to control. And I thought again of the little girl in the wrong boots, proud of her own name in her own handwriting, running toward me through the stubble rows. "What money?" Diane said. Her voice was quiet. "Garrett, what money did you need?" He didn't answer. He stood with his back half to us, looking at a kitchen window he'd never once offered to wash. And the silence he left was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man calculating how much more he could keep. Garrett turned from the window. Whatever had cracked open in him a moment ago, he had found a way to close it back up. Or at least to paper over it. Which in my experience amounts to the same thing in the short term, and to nothing at all in the long one. He squared his shoulders. He smoothed the front of his shirt. When he looked at me again, the fear was gone, or hidden, and in its place was the expression I had seen him use at every family gathering for 16 years. The patient, slightly condescending look of a man who believes he understands the world better than the people around him, and is prepared to prove it. "Earl," he said, "I want you to think carefully about what you're doing here." "All right," I said. "You've had a serious medical event. You're grieving. Those 2 things together can affect a man's judgment in ways he's not always aware of." He said this with something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite pity, but was trying to pass for both. The easement Ruth signed, and I'm not conceding the validity of that document, but even if it holds, there are structures, financial instruments, ways to work around a conservation restriction that still deliver value to. "Define instrument," I said. He paused. "I'm sorry. Financial instrument. You use the phrase. Define it." "It's a standard term, Earl. It refers to any vehicle through which—" "I know what it means," I said. "I'm asking you to define it, specifically, in the context of this property and this easement." I sat back down at the table and folded my hands. I had watched men like Garrett my entire adult life. Men who had learned that a certain kind of language, used with confidence and pace, could move through a room before anyone thought to stop it and ask what it meant. The trick was simply to stop it. Because when a man can't define his own terms, it usually means the terms are doing work he'd rather not have examined. Garrett's jaw moved slightly. The point is that an easement doesn't make the land worthless. There are tax benefits, conservation credits, leaseback arrangements that could still generate. How much do you owe? I said. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Marian was sitting with her hands folded, making no move. Diane had turned slightly in her chair to look at her husband. The angle of her body had shifted in a way I recognized. It was the posture of a person who is no longer fully certain whose side of the room they are on. That's not relevant to, it's the most relevant thing in this room, I said. You came here today to sell my land, not Diane's land, mine. Land that, as of 4 years ago, couldn't be sold for development, regardless of what anyone signed or didn't sign. And when Marian laid that document on the table, you didn't look surprised the way a man looks surprised. You looked scared, the way a man looks scared when something he was counting on disappears. I let that sit for a moment. Scared men aren't reaching for something, Garrett. They're running from something. So I'll ask again, how much do you owe? And to whom? His eyes cut to Diane. Not with warmth, not with the look of a husband seeking his wife's support in a difficult moment. It was the look of a man checking an exit, a brief, calculating flick that registered what she represented in the room and moved on. I saw Diane see it. She was still looking at him when his eyes came back to me. This is not the time or place for, he started. Heartland Ag, Diane said. Garrett went still. It was different from the stillness of a man choosing his words. This was the stillness of a man who has heard a sound he hoped he'd never hear in this particular room. You said it last week, Diane continued. On the phone. I was in the kitchen and you thought I was upstairs. Heartland Ag Opportunities Fund. She said the name the way you'd say the name of something you'd found and weren't sure yet whether it was harmless. I didn't ask you about it then. I probably should have. Her eyes were steady on him. What is it? Garrett said nothing. It's an investment fund, I said. Not because I knew for certain, not yet, but because I had spent 3 weeks gathering pieces, and some pieces, you understand, before you've seen the whole picture. The way a farmer can read rain in a cloud formation before the first drop falls. He's been offering people a place to put money. Farm families around here. People who trust a name they recognize. I looked at Garrett. That's right, isn't it? They trust the Hartley name. Because this is Hartley country, and you married into it. And you've been letting that trust do work for you. Something moved across Garrett's face that wasn't denial. It was the specific expression of a man who has realized that the room has become smaller than he thought, that the door he planned to use is no longer where he left it. Whose money is in it, Garrett? Diane said. Her voice hadn't risen. If anything, it had dropped, gone quieter and more careful, the way the air goes quiet before weather. I want you to tell me whose money is in Heartland Ag. He looked at her for a moment. That same calculating flick. Then he looked out the window at the east field, where 4 generations of Hartley ground lay flat and cold and frozen under the November sky, indifferent and enduring, holding everything that had ever been committed to it. He didn't answer her, but his silence, in that moment, was answer enough. Marian excused herself to make a phone call from the front porch, which was the polite way of giving us the room. Garrett went out the back door without a word. Not running, he was too careful for that, but moving with the purposeful stride of a man who needed open air and a few minutes alone with whatever was happening inside his head. I watched him through the kitchen window,
moving out across the yard toward the equipment shed, hands in his pockets, not looking back. I put the kettle on. It was habit, the same as the coffee cups. I took 2 mugs from the cabinet, the blue ceramic one that had been mine for 30 years, and the white one with a small chip on the handle that Ruth had refused to throw away, because she said a mug that had lasted that long had earned the right to keep being used. I set them both on the counter. The kettle started its slow climb toward boiling. I stood there and looked at the 2 cups, and thought about the 10,000 mornings I had stood in this kitchen doing exactly this. And how Ruth had always come in from somewhere, the garden, the mudroom, the living room by the time the kettle was ready. And how now the white cup just sat there, waiting, and nobody came. I poured 1 cup. I left the other empty. I set Ruth's cup on the table anyway. I always did. I didn't have a rational justification for it. I just couldn't stop. "You're going to tell me you were really that sick," Diane said. I turned around. She was still in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest, in a posture that was half anger and half something more fragile underneath. I had seen that posture since she was 14 years old. It was the posture she used when she was afraid of what she was about to say, but was going to say it anyway. "I'm not going to tell you anything," I said. "I'm going to let you say what you need to say." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth's empty cup. "You staged this," she said. "All of it. The way you signed that paper, Marion showing up, that document of Mom's." Her jaw was tight. "You were never as helpless as you let us think. Were you?" "No," I said. "I wasn't." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've been given the answer they expected, and it still hits harder than they prepared for. "Do you know what it was like?" she said. "Getting the call from the hospital? Being told your father has had a stroke and you need to come." Her voice was steady, but only the way a fence is steady that hasn't been tested yet. "I dropped everything, Dad. I sat in that hospital chair every night for 4 days." "I know," I said. "I was there." "And you were watching us," she said. "The whole time, deciding what to do, running whatever calculation you run." She uncrossed her arms and put her hands flat on the table. "You've been running that calculation my entire life, watching the weather, watching the yield reports, watching the market. You always knew exactly what you were doing and why, and the rest of us were just variables." I sat down across from her. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug and let the warmth come through. Outside, I could hear Garrett somewhere near the equipment shed, a door opening and closing. I wanted to defend myself. "I want you to know that, because I think it matters." The defense was there, ready and available. I could have pointed out that I had worked those fields to put food on the table and shoes on her feet, that the land didn't tend itself, that a man who takes care of what he's responsible for isn't the same as a man who doesn't care. All of that was true. I knew it was true. I also knew it wasn't the whole truth. And I had reached an age and a stillness where I couldn't tell the partial truth anymore without feeling the weight of what I was leaving out. "You're right that I was watching," I said. "I've been watching everything my whole life. It's how I'm built. And you're right that there were times, a lot of times, when I was so busy watching the fields and the weather and the numbers that I forgot to watch the people in the house." I looked at her. "I forgot to watch you. And I knew it was happening, and I told myself it was temporary, that when things settled down I'd do better. And then 30 years went by, and things never settled down, and I never did better.
That's the truth. And I'm sorry for it. I've been sorry for a long time. Diane looked at the empty white cup. Her mother's cup, chipped handle and all. Something moved through her face that I didn't have words for. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the first small movement in the direction of something more complicated and more real than anger. That doesn't mean what we did was right, she said, very quietly. No, I said. It doesn't. We sat there in the quiet kitchen. The November light was changing toward late afternoon, going gold and thin. The tractor on the Mueller place had stopped at some point, and the silence in its absence was very large. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out my phone. There's one thing I need you to hear before tonight, I said, because I want you to have the full picture. I want to make sure you understand that what happened 3 weeks ago in that field was real. I found the number in my contacts and pressed call, then speaker. His name is Dr. Addison. He's the attending physician who treated me at Cedar County Memorial. I asked him to be available this afternoon. I set the phone on the table between us. I want you to hear it from him. The voice that came through the phone was unhurried and precise. The way doctors learn to be when they have to deliver information that cannot be taken back. This is Dr. Addison, he said. I was the attending physician for Earl Hartley at Cedar County Memorial from November 7th through the 11th. Is this a convenient time? It is, I said. My daughter is here. Go ahead, please. Mr. Hartley presented with an ischemic stroke affecting the left middle cerebral artery territory. Dr. Addison said. The event was classified as moderate in severity, which in practical terms means it was serious enough to cause lasting neurological effects in a significant percentage of patients his age. He was fortunate in that he received intervention within the window that limited the extent of damage. He was not fortunate in that it happened at all, or that he was alone when it did. A brief pause. To be direct, another 20 minutes on that field before he was found, and we would likely be having a different conversation. His recovery has been good. His prognosis, with appropriate care and reduced stress, is reasonable. But the event itself was real, and it was severe. I want to be clear about that. Thank you, Doctor, I said. I appreciate you making yourself available. Of course. Earl, take care of yourself. I ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. Diane had not moved since Dr. Addison began speaking. She sat with her hands flat on the table, the same position she'd had when she was pressing her case against me 20 minutes ago. But everything about her posture had changed. The structure had gone out of it. She was looking at the phone on the table, not at me, not at Ruth's empty cup. Just at the phone, the way a person looks at an object that has just said something they cannot unhear. Diane, I said. She shook her head slightly. Not at me, at something interior. You could have died out there, she said. The words came out stripped down to their plain meaning, all the edge gone out of them. Alone, in that field. Hank got to me, I said. Hank. She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. Like she was suddenly aware of how much of my life had been held up by people she hadn't paid attention to. She looked at the empty white cup. I thought. She stopped. I know what you thought, I said. And I said it gently, because I did know, and because I understood why she'd thought it. And because the understanding didn't cancel the hurt, but it did change its shape somewhat.
The sound of car tires on the gravel drive came through the window before either of us could say anything else. Then another car behind it. I had forgotten about the neighbors. Word travels fast in a small county, and the word that had traveled today was that the Hartley place had been sold, and old Earl had taken the Cardinal Ridge money. In Harlan Bend, that meant you showed up with food. 3 women from the church came through the back door inside of 10 minutes. Lasagna, dinner rolls, a chocolate layer cake. Behind them came the Fenners from next door, the Muellers, 2 more couples whose names I remembered only once I saw their faces. They came in smiling. The smiles didn't last long. There is a particular discomfort when a room full of people arrive expecting a celebration and find something else. The something else was visible in the document on the table, in the stillness of my daughter's face, in the presence of Marian Ellsworth, a woman in a good suit who did not appear to be anyone's aunt or neighbor. The smiles faded. People set their dishes on the counter with the careful manner of guests who have arrived at the wrong party and aren't yet sure whether to stay or go. "We heard the news," Connie Mueller said to me, looking around the room. "About the farm. We thought—" "I appreciate it," I said. "Why don't you all stay? There's something tonight that involves the whole community. I'll explain shortly." That settled it into a different kind of waiting. The back door opened again, and Garrett came in from the yard. He was composed. Whatever he had worked through outside, he'd gotten a handle on it. Or decided to behave as if he had. He stepped into the kitchen, registered the crowd, and did a quick inventory of the room. The kind of inventory a man does when he is calculating his options. His eyes moved over the neighbors, over Marian, over me. They moved over Diane the way they'd move over a piece of furniture. A brief recognition, a categorization, and then on to the next thing that mattered more. I watched Diane notice it. The particular way she went still when his eyes passed over her without stopping. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the table and picked up her coffee cup and held it with both hands, the way I'd seen her hold things since she was small, when she was trying to keep something from showing on her face. The screen door banged open a 3rd time. Roy Hartley was 69 years old, my older brother by 2 years, a retired Delta ground crew supervisor who had lived in Cedar County his whole life and drove a 15-year-old pickup because he saw no reason to change what worked. He came through the door in his barn coat, saw me, and made his way across the crowded kitchen with the particular walk of a man who has something on his mind and intends to say it. "Earl." He gripped my hand briefly in the handshake that had been our greeting since we were grown men, firm and quick. Then he lowered his voice, though not by much. "I've been meaning to call you. About that fund Garrett had me put money into." His eyes went to Garrett across the room, then back to me. "Something doesn't feel right. I'd like to understand what I'm actually in." I put my hand on Roy's arm and steered him toward the far end of the kitchen, near the window that looked out over the driveway. The room had grown louder in the way rooms do when they fill with people who know each other and don't know what to do with their hands. Someone had plugged in the coffee maker. Connie Mueller was moving dishes around on the counter to make room in the way that women of a certain generation do when they're not sure what else to offer. The smell of lasagna warming in the oven was already in the air, which under other circumstances would have been the most comforting smell in the world, and under these circumstances was simply strange. "Tell me what you put in," I said to Roy quietly. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded sheet of paper. His bank statement. Printed on the old inkjet printer he'd had since 2008, because it still worked and he wasn't about to spend money on a new one. He unfolded it and held it out to me without speaking, his finger on a line near the bottom. The number was not as large as what Garrett would have wanted, I suspected.
but it was large enough. For a retired Delta ground crew supervisor living on a fixed income in Cedar County, Iowa, it was very large indeed. It was the kind of number that meant something, the kind you don't arrive at by accident. He said it was conservative, Roy said. Farm-based. Something that would appreciate steady. He used your name, Earl. Said you were aware of it. Said the family had vetted it. His eyes were steady on me. Not accusatory. Asking. Roy had always had that quality. He'd take a wrong answer over no answer, every time. Was that true? No, I said. It wasn't. Roy looked at the statement in his hand. Then he folded it and put it back in his pocket with the deliberate movements of a man who is carefully not reacting to something he has just confirmed he already suspected. All right, he said. The Brants had come closer. Not intrusively, they were too polite for that. But close enough that Don Brant, a third-generation hog farmer with a voice like gravel and the handshake of a man who'd spent 50 years using his hands, had caught enough of the exchange to know what it was about. He stepped in without apology. Same fund, he said. Roy looked at him. Heartland Ag. Don Brant's jaw set. He looked across the room to where Garrett was standing near the back door with his phone in his hand. And then he looked back at me. Beside him, Linda Brant had gone very still. Don, she said quietly. The way wives say a name when they need their husband to understand something without the room hearing it. I heard you, he said. They were not the only ones. Over the next 10 minutes, in the way that conversations travel through a small room when people are listening more carefully than they seem to be, 3 more people found their way to the corner where Roy and I were standing. Pete Vogel from the south side of the county, who raised corn and soybeans on 300 acres and had shaken Garrett's hand at the feed and fuel in town. The Hendersons, older couple, retired from farming, living on their savings. All of them had heard a version of the same pitch. All of them had heard some version of my name in it. I did not look at Garrett while this was happening. I didn't need to. I knew he was watching. I knew he was calculating. I had spent enough time in the same room as Garrett Voss to understand that his primary occupation, beneath whatever else he appeared to be doing, was always the same. Assessing where the exits were. Marion had come back in from the porch. She stood near the hallway entrance with her document bag, watching the room the way she watched everything steadily, without urgency, taking inventory. She caught my eye once and gave a small nod that meant she was ready. Connie Mueller, pouring coffee at the counter, looked up and said, "Earl, I keep meaning to ask, whatever happened to your boy Caleb? Haven't seen him in, 5 or 6 years now?" The question landed in a small pocket of quiet that happened to open up at just the right moment, the way questions sometimes do. Montana, I said. Veterinary practice up there. He's doing well. Always was a steady one, Connie said. Ruth must have been proud. She was, I said. And that was true. And it was one of the things I knew without needing the details, the way you know certain things about people who loved the same people you did. Ruth had been proud of Caleb in the particular way she was proud of things that had grown right without making a fuss about it. I would find out later, reading her letter, exactly how much she had done quietly to make sure he stayed that way. But that came later. For now. Marion had moved to the kitchen table. She set her document bag on it and unclipped the top with a sound that cut through the room the way deliberate sounds do when a room is already half listening for something to tell it what to do. People turned. Marion looked around at the assembled faces. Neighbors. Family. People who had brought food for a celebration that was not going to happen the way they'd imagined. And she spoke in the clear, carrying voice of a woman who had stood in front of rooms her entire professional life and understood that how you begin a thing determines whether people hear what comes next. "I think everyone should sit down," she said. "There's something here that concerns all of you, and I'd rather say it once, plainly, so there's no confusion about what we're dealing with." People found places to sit. There weren't enough chairs for everyone, so people leaned against counters and stood in the doorways and pulled stools in from the mudroom, the way Iowans have arranged themselves around unexpected gatherings since before any of us were born. The lasagna continued to warm in the oven. Nobody mentioned it. Marion set 3 manila folders on the kitchen table and opened the first one. She did not look hurried, and she did not look apologetic, and she did not begin by asking whether anyone had questions or concerns. She simply began. "I'm going to explain what I've found," she said. "And I'm going to explain it plainly, because what I have here isn't complicated when you take the financial language out of it. The language is the complication. Underneath it, this is a simple story." I watched the room while she talked. That is something I have done my whole life. Watched rooms while other people spoke in them. You learn things that way that you can't learn by speaking yourself. Heartland Ag Opportunities Fund is a private investment vehicle registered in Delaware, Marion said. It was established 18 months ago by Garrett Voss. It was represented to investors as a conservative, agriculture-based fund that would produce stable returns. Investors were told their money would be used to acquire interests in farm equipment leasing, grain elevator operations, and agricultural commodities futures. She paused. "None of those things happened," Don Brandt said. "Then where did it go?" "I'm going to show you," Marion said. She laid 2 pages side by side on the table. On the left was a bank statement for the Heartland Ag account. On the right was a record of outgoing transfers. She walked the room through it the way a good teacher walks a class through a problem. Not fast, not slow. Pointing at each number in sequence so that everyone could follow the path the money had taken. It had gone in as investments. It had come out as transfers to a brokerage account in Garrett's name that had been used to cover margin calls on options trades that had gone wrong. Some of it had gone to a line of credit he'd taken out against a property in Dubuque. Some of it had moved in smaller amounts to accounts Marion had traced but not yet fully identified, which was a detail she noted without dwelling on it. What remained in the Heartland Ag account was a fraction of what had gone in. Considerably less than a fraction. The kind of number that means a fund is not late returning money, or having a bad quarter, or waiting on a market correction. It means there is no money left to return. The room was very quiet while Marion talked. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. The kind that has weight to it. Garrett spoke from across the room. "Those transfers represent legitimate operating expenses and—" "Garrett." I said his name once, not loudly. He stopped. Marion continued. She turned to Roy's statement, which Roy had handed to her without being asked, and she laid it on the table alongside the Heartland Ag records. She showed where his deposit had entered the fund account. She showed the date. She showed the subsequent transfers that had moved that money out. Roy stood with his arms folded across his chest, in the way he had stood at the graveside of every family member he'd ever buried. Which was how Roy stood when he was holding something inside that he had decided was his to hold and nobody else's. He looked at the pages on the table. He looked at the line where his deposit appeared. He followed Marion's pen as she traced where it had gone after that. When Marion stopped speaking, Roy said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "That fund, the money I put in." His voice was level,
But I knew my brother. I had known him since before either of us could read. And I knew the particular flatness his voice got when emotion had moved past the point of normal expression and come out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. I put that in 18 months ago. I'd been setting it aside since I started at Delta in 1978. He looked at the page. He did not look at Garrett. I told myself I'd leave it for my grandkids. Something to pass on. He was quiet for a moment. That's 30 years at Delta, Earl. Every dollar of it. Nobody in the room spoke. The oven timer went off then. The small mechanical chirp of the lasagna reaching temperature. And in the silence, it was almost obscenely ordinary. Connie Mueller moved automatically to turn it off, then stopped with her hand on the dial, as if she'd forgotten what she'd stood up to do. I looked at Garrett. He was looking at the floor now, his phone loose in his hand. And whatever composure he had managed to reconstruct in the yard outside had developed visible cracks. He was the kind of man who could perform confidence like a second skin. But performance requires an audience that is at least partially willing. And the audience in my kitchen at that moment was not willing. The room had the particular quality that a courtroom has after a verdict. Not chaos, not noise, just a collective settling into a new reality that everyone present is separately processing. Roy raised his eyes from the table and looked at me. "What happens now?" he said. I looked at Marion. Marion reached into the folder for the second set of pages. "Now," she said, "we talk about the Brandts." The Brandt file was thinner than Roy's, but the number in it was larger. Marion set it on the table without preamble. She had learned, I think, somewhere in the last hour, that this room did not need introduction. It only needed information. Don Brandt stood very still while Marion read it out. He was not a man who made displays of himself under any circumstances. I had known him 30 years and seen him lose a barn to lightning and a crop to flooding and a good dog to old age. And he had weathered all of it with the same set jaw and level gaze that he wore now. But his hands, crossed over his chest, tightened once when Marion said the figure. And that single tightening was, for Don Brandt, the equivalent of another man's breakdown. Linda Brandt made a sound that she cut off almost before it started. "That was our retirement," she said. Not to Garrett, not to the room. Just said it, the way you say a thing out loud sometimes, because the alternative is letting it stay inside you where it's worse. Marion closed the Brandt folder and set it aside. She moved to the next one. Pete Vogel's was smaller. He'd been cautious, he said later, because something about the pitch hadn't settled right with him, though the name attached to it had been enough to get him to write the check anyway. The Hendersons was the one that quieted the room a second time. Margaret Henderson was 72 years old and had been farming Cedar County her whole life. And the amount she'd put into Heartland Ag represented, as best I could calculate from what she'd told Roy earlier, the better part of what remained after her husband passed and the medical bills came in. When Marion laid the last page down, she did not speak. She let the room do its own arithmetic. People looked at the numbers on the table. People looked at Garrett. It was Pete Vogel who said what was in the room. "You used Earl's name to get us to trust you." He said it flatly, the way you state a fact you've confirmed. "You knew we'd trust Earl." "Earl had no involvement in the fund," Garrett said. His voice had changed again. Something underneath was showing through now. Something impatient and cold. Like a man who has been playing a character for too long and is tired of the performance. "He doesn't understand investment structures. None of you do. That's not a criticism. It's just..." "Choose your next words carefully,"
Roy said. Garrett looked at him. Whatever he saw in Roy's face, and Roy's face in that moment, was not a complicated thing to read. It did not stop him entirely. The market moved against the fund, he said. That happens. It happens to institutional investors. It happens to people who understand the risk landscape. The idea that I was somehow... He paused, and the pause was one beat too long. And in that beat, something shifted in how he was standing. Something loosened that had been held. That I owe this room an explanation. As if any of you would have understood the strategy, even if I'd laid it out in full, is frankly... Garrett? Diane's voice. He stopped. He looked at her. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. It was the same look I had cataloged earlier, the brief registration, the categorization, the movement on to whatever mattered more. But this time the room saw it. This time, 17 people in a kitchen in Cedar County, Iowa, watched Garrett Voss look at his wife of 16 years the way you look at an object that is mildly inconveniencing you. The silence that followed was a different quality from the silences before it. Don Brandt uncrossed his arms. My wife and I worked this county for 30 years, he said. His voice was quiet in the way that very large things are quiet before they move. We didn't come to this kitchen tonight to be told we wouldn't understand. We came because this is Hartley ground, and the Hartley family means something in this county. And you... He stopped. And the stopping was deliberate. A man choosing not to say a word he would regret in front of this particular company. You used that. Garrett opened his mouth. Enough, I said. I had been quiet for a long time. Longer than was comfortable, maybe. But I have learned from farming, from marriage, from loss, that there are moments when the right thing is to let a room arrive at its own conclusion without being steered there. Because a conclusion people reach on their own is more durable than one that's handed to them. This room had arrived. I could feel it the way you feel a weather change before the sky shows it a shift in pressure, in weight, in the particular way people were holding themselves. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out my phone. There's something I need everyone in this room to hear, I said. Before tonight goes any further, before anyone says anything else or makes any more decisions about what this is or isn't. I found the audio file in my recordings. I looked at Diane when I said the next part. Not at Garrett. At my daughter. Because what was about to come out of this phone was going to be harder for her than for anyone else in the room. And she deserved to know it was coming. This is a recording. It was made 6 weeks ago. The voice you're going to hear is Garrett's. Diane looked at me. I pressed play. The recording began with road noise. Garrett had been in his car when he made this call, 6 weeks ago. Somewhere between Cedar County and wherever he'd been going that afternoon. I had not known then what I'd captured. I had set my phone to record when I first started to understand what was happening. Not because I knew what I was going to hear, but because Ruth had always said that a man who writes things down is harder to argue with than a man who only remembers them. And recording was my version of writing things down. The road noise settled, and then there was the sound of a call connecting, and then Garrett's voice. Not the voice I had heard all day, not the careful, modulated voice he used when he was managing a room. This was the voice of a man alone in a car on a county highway, talking to someone he didn't need to perform for. It's me, he said. Yeah. Listen, I need to talk about the timeline on the Cedar County property. A pause. The other voice inaudible. Because the situation has changed. That's why. The old man had his stroke last month, and it's an opportunity. The POA is done. Diane's signed off, and Foley says Cardinal Ridge can close inside of 30 days if we move. Another pause. No, she doesn't know the details. She thinks this is about getting Earl settled somewhere manageable. Diane has always been the way in, not the decision maker. That's how it's worked. That's how it had to work. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear someone's breathing from across the room. The land was always the point, Garrett continued. His voice was matter of fact, the voice of a man discussing logistics. Diane's family has held that acreage for 4 generations. 4 generations of people who understand dirt and weather and what the beans are selling for. And not much else. That's not me being harsh. That's the landscape. The name means something out there. The Hartley name opens doors I couldn't open on my own. That's valuable. I've been using that value. I intend to keep using it. I did not look at Garrett during this. I looked at Diane. I have watched my daughter's face my entire life. I watched it when she was an infant and didn't yet understand what expressions were for. I watched it through childhood and the complicated years and all the distances that had grown between us. I watched it in the hospital 4 weeks ago when I was the sick man in the bed and she was trying to decide what she felt about that. And I watched it now in my kitchen. While the voice of her husband of 16 years came out of a small speaker and said the things he said when no one who mattered was listening. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't make noise. Diane was experiencing that kind now. I could see it moving through her the way cold moves through open ground in November. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady and thorough and reaching everything. The recording was still playing. "She'll go along with whatever I tell her," Garrett said. I'm not saying it to be cold about it. She trusts me. She's always trusted me. That's useful. That's an asset. Same as the name. A short pause. If the deal closes before the old man is back on his feet, there's nothing to contest. We take the Cardinal Ridge money, pay down the Heartland exposure, and the rest of it goes away. Clean. The road noise again. A turn signal, faintly. "Just keep Foley patient," Garrett said. "A week. 2 at most. The family's distracted. The stroke did us a favor." The recording ended. The silence that followed was of a kind I had not experienced before in that kitchen, or perhaps in any room. It was the silence of people who have just heard something that cannot be fitted into the version of events they had been carrying, and are now standing in the gap between the old version and whatever comes next. Margaret Henderson, who was 72 years old and had not said a word since Marion finished with her file, said quietly, "He called it an asset. His own wife." Nobody added to that. I put my phone down on the table. Across the room, Garrett had gone very still. The stillness of a man who has run out of angles. His eyes moved to Diane, and for the first time since I'd known him, what I saw in them was not calculation. It was something more like the recognition arriving slowly, the way recognition arrives when you've been resisting it, that he had miscalculated something fundamental, and that the room he was standing in had just become a room he could not navigate his way out of. Diane had not moved. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the phone on the table. Not at me, not at Garrett, just at the phone, where her husband's voice had just finished telling someone that she was useful the way a tool is useful, and that her trust was an asset, the same as a family name and a piece of ground. Then she stood up. She didn't say anything.
She didn't look at Garrett. She pushed her chair back from the table, and she walked across that kitchen, past the counter with the covered dishes, past Ruth's empty cup still sitting where I'd left it, past Marion and Roy and Don Brandt and all the people from this county who had come in with casseroles and left with the understanding of what had been done to them. And she stopped at the far end of the table, next to me. And she stood there. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Nobody moved for a moment. That's the thing about a room that has just witnessed something irreversible. There's always a pause while people catch up to what they've seen. Diane was standing next to me, not touching me, not speaking, just standing. And the kitchen rearranged itself around that fact. People shifted. Chairs scraped. Don Brandt looked at her with an expression that held something close to respect. The way you look at a person who has just done a hard thing cleanly. Garrett hadn't moved from his position near the back window. He still had his phone in his hand. He was looking at Diane with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not calculating now, not performing, but genuinely uncertain. The look of a man who has just had a fundamental assumption removed and is standing in the resulting gap, trying to figure out what the floor is. He opened his mouth. "Diane, don't." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn to look at him. She was looking straight ahead at the wall above the kitchen table, at the spot where Ruth had hung a framed embroidery piece 30 years ago that still hung there. A simple thing with a verse from Psalms that I had stopped seeing years ago from looking at it every day. "Don't say my name right now." He closed his mouth. I looked at Diane beside me, at the line of her jaw and the set of her shoulders and the particular stillness that she had inherited, whether she knew it or not, from her mother. Ruth had that same stillness in difficult moments, the stillness of someone who has made a decision and is now simply occupying it, waiting for the world to catch up. It made me think of a morning when Diane was 9 years old. I had promised to take her fishing at the South Pond on Saturday. By Saturday, there was something wrong with the planter, and I spent the day in the equipment shed. When I came in at dark, Diane was sitting at this table with her fishing rod assembled and leaning against her chair, and she hadn't said a word. Just looked at me for a long moment with those clear eyes, and then gone to bed. I had told myself she understood. I had told myself that's what farm children learned, that weather and machinery didn't care about Saturday plans, and that understanding that was part of growing up on the land. I had told myself that for 30 years. Standing in my kitchen tonight, watching my daughter choose a side with nothing more than the act of walking across a room, I found I couldn't tell myself that story anymore. Ruth had known. That was the thing I was beginning to understand. She had known what the fishing rod leaning against the chair had meant, and what all the similar mornings had accumulated into. She had watched it happen and done what a mother does when a father is somewhere else, tried to bridge the distance, quietly, in the ways she could. And when she knew she was dying, she had written it down. Whatever she had written, I hadn't read it yet. But I understood now, standing next to my daughter, that the letter in my pocket was not only about the land. Marion came to stand beside me quietly. "The county sheriff's office has a deputy on the way," she said, keeping her voice low. "I made the call from the porch an hour ago. Fraud, forgery, and a potential wire fraud referral. It will take the time it takes." "All right," I said. Across the room, something had shifted in Garrett. The uncertainty was resolving itself not into remorse, not into any of the things it might have resolved into in a better man, but into a kind of cold efficiency. I recognized it because I had seen it before, in that hospital corridor. He was calculating. He was looking for the move. He put his phone in his pocket. He picked his coat up from the hook by the back door. Roy said, without raising his voice, "I wouldn't." Garrett looked at him. Roy looked back. He had 30 years of loading luggage in all weather on the ramp at an international airport, and he was not a man who was going to be moved by being looked at. "Hank's outside," I said, which was true. Hank Mueller, who had found me in that field 3 weeks ago and gotten his arm under mine and said, "I got you," was outside, as I had asked him to be an hour before any of this began. Because I had known this moment was likely to come, and I had not wanted to leave it to chance. Garrett's hand came away from the coat. The front door opened. It opened quietly, the way doors open when the person on the other side is being careful about something. Careful not to startle, maybe. Or careful about what they're walking into. A cold draft came through from the November dark outside. And then Caleb Hartley stepped into the kitchen. He was 38 years old and looked like me at that age, or like the photographs of me at that age, which is as close as any of us can get to seeing ourselves clearly. He was wearing a canvas jacket with road dust on it and carrying a duffel bag that suggested he hadn't stopped long enough to change. He'd driven 20 hours from Montana in the way that certain people respond to family emergencies, not by calling ahead, not by negotiating timing, just by getting in the truck and driving until they get there. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. 17 people, covered dishes on the counter, legal documents on the table, and his sister standing next to his father in a way that told most of the story without a word being spoken. His eyes found mine. "Am I late?" he said. "No," I said. "You're right on time." Caleb set his duffel bag down just inside the door and took in the room the way he always had, quietly, without performance, absorbing what was in front of him before deciding what to do about it. He was my son, and I had not seen him in 14 months, and the sight of him standing in that doorway with the November cold still on his jacket hit me somewhere I hadn't been expecting. Some things you don't know you've been carrying until you set them down. People made room. That's what Cedar County people do when something is happening and a new piece of it has just arrived. They shift, they adjust, they find a way to give the moment what it needs. Connie Mueller, still at the counter, said "Caleb," in the quiet voice of someone who has known a person since childhood and is glad to see them alive and present. Roy gripped his nephew's arm briefly and then stepped back. Caleb looked at Diane. Diane looked at Caleb. They had not spoken in 3 years. Whatever had fractured between them had fractured slowly and then all at once, the way most family things do. And I had been the wrong kind of present for all of it, physically there, emotionally elsewhere. That was another stone I had been carrying. I was becoming aware of how many there were, but here was something I had not anticipated. They didn't need me to bridge it. Diane made a sound that wasn't quite his name and wasn't quite anything else. And Caleb crossed the kitchen to where she was standing beside me. And for a moment, they just stood there next to each other, not embracing, not speaking, just occupying the same small piece of floor, and something passed between them that belonged to them and not to anyone else in the room. Then Caleb looked at Garrett. Garrett was still standing near the back window. He had put his coat down again after Roy's intervention and was now positioned in the particular way of a man running calculations, not running yet, but ready, watching for the moment when readiness becomes necessary. "Caleb," Garrett said. The performance voice again, one more time. The reasonable man, the family member, the misunderstood party. "I think if you hear the full situation..." "I heard it,"
Caleb said. I listened from the porch.
Garrett looked at him.
It's cold out there, Caleb said. Took me a while to get feeling back in my fingers. He said this the way he said most things, simply, without inflection, as if he were reporting weather. I heard enough. Garrett put his hand back on his coat. He moved toward the back door. What happened next was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that because I think the absence of drama is part of what made it what it was. Hank Mueller came through the back door just as Garrett reached it, not running, not aggressive, just there. The way Hank was always just there when the situation required it. Garrett stopped. Hank looked at him with the patient expression of a man who has outlasted harder weather than this and has nowhere else to be. 3 seconds passed. Then the front door opened again, and a Cedar County deputy named Griggs, who I had spoken with 2 weeks prior and who had driven out from the county seat on a Tuesday evening without complaint, stepped into the kitchen. He was in his mid-40s, compact, methodical, and he looked at Marion first because Marion was the one who'd made the call, and he knew it. Ms. Ellsworth, he said. Deputy, she said. Thank you for coming. He looked at Garrett. Mr. Voss, I'm going to need you to come with me. Garrett looked at the deputy. He looked at the room. He did the calculation one final time and arrived at the same answer he'd been arriving at for the past hour, which was that there were no more moves, which was the first honest accounting he had performed in some time. He put his coat on. He walked toward the front door. He passed within 3 feet of where Diane was standing. He did not look at her. Not a glance. Not a hesitation. Not the flicker of a man who is holding himself back from something. He walked past her the way you walk past a piece of furniture in a room you are leaving. And he went through the door. And the deputy went with him. And the door closed. The kitchen held the silence of that for a long moment. I was watching Diane. I watched her watch the door close. I watched her face move through something I didn't try to name because naming it would have been a reduction of it. She stood there for the count of perhaps 5 seconds, and then she straightened that heartly straightness that Ruth had had, and that Diane had gotten whether she wanted it or not, and she turned back to the room. She was all right. She wasn't fine. And she wouldn't be fine for a long time, but she was all right. And in that moment, all right was enough. The room began to exhale. Caleb put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his. And I looked at the two of them standing there, and I thought of Ruth, and felt her absence the way you feel the absence of a load-bearing wall after it's been removed. Everything around it slightly shifted, adjusted to an absence it was never designed for. I reached into my coat pocket. The envelope was there where it had been for weeks, yellowed at the edges, sealed with the kind of care Ruth brought to everything she considered important. Her handwriting on the front, in the particular slant I had read for 39 years. She had addressed it simply, not to me, not to the estate, just Diane. I held it out. Diane, I said, there's something your mother wanted you to read. Diane took the envelope from my hand. She held it for a moment without opening it, looking at her name in her mother's handwriting. Ruth had particular letters. The D in Diane curled back on itself in a way I had been watching for 39 years, on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the backs of seed catalog envelopes. And seeing it now, in this context, in this kitchen, after this day, was the kind of thing that gets into your chest before your brain has time to prepare for it. The neighbors had understood, without being asked, that something private was happening. Some had moved quietly toward the front room. Others turned slightly away, giving the family the only privacy a full kitchen can offer. Averted eyes and held breath. Caleb stood to Diane's left. I stood to her right. She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, in Ruth's even, careful script. The paper had the yellowing of something sealed for years. Diane unfolded it slowly and began to read. She read it silently at first, her eyes moving down the first page. I watched her face the way I had been watching it all day for the geography of what was passing through her, the weather of it. What I saw was not what I expected. I had expected more of the same controlled fracture she'd been managing since the recording played. What I saw instead was something different, something more fundamental. She looked up at me after the first page. She knew, Diane said. Not a question. Yes, I said. She went back to reading. And then, after a moment, she began to read it aloud. I don't know why. Perhaps because some things are too large to carry silently, or perhaps because Caleb deserved to hear it, or perhaps because Ruth had always spoken plainly, and reading her words in silence felt like a betrayal of that. I'm writing this, Ruth had written, because I won't be there to say it. And some things should be said before they become permanent. She had known about Diane's resentment. Not just guessed at it, known it, traced it, understood its origins with the clarity that Ruth brought to everything she thought was important. She had written it plainly the summer Diane was 16, when she had been accepted to an art program in Des Moines 2 months. Residential. Something she had worked toward for 2 years in secret, because she hadn't wanted to explain wanting it. And Earl had asked her to stay, because the planter had broken down in the first week of June, and there was no one else, and they couldn't afford to fall behind on the planting window that year. Diane had stayed. I had known she was disappointed. I had told myself she understood. I had told myself that, and then moved on, and not thought about it again for 30 years. Ruth had thought about it. Ruth had been thinking about it since that summer. She had written, Diane stayed because she was asked to, and because she loved her father, and because she had not yet learned to say no to him. And I watched her put something away in herself that summer that I don't think ever fully came back. That is what I should have confronted your father about, directly, instead of trying to smooth it over. That was my mistake. I made it because I was afraid of what a real confrontation would cost us. And I let that fear cost Diane something instead. The kitchen was very quiet. I want you to understand, Ruth had written, why a man like Garrett could reach you. Not to excuse what you chose. You're old enough to own your choices, and you know it. But because understanding why we're vulnerable is different from excusing what we do with that vulnerability. She had written that Garrett had told Diane the story she already believed about herself, that the farm had held her back, that she deserved more, that she had given years of her life to something that didn't value what she'd given. That story has truth in it, Ruth had written. The truth is what made it dangerous. Diane's voice had steadied as she read. The kind of steadying that comes not from composure, but from going somewhere so deep into something that the surface stops mattering. I locked the land, Ruth had written, not because I didn't trust Earl with it. I trust Earl with everything I've ever loved. I locked it because I wanted there to always be a fixed point. Something that couldn't drift away while the rest of us were busy being hurt and distant and afraid to say what we meant. I wanted there to be somewhere for everyone to come back to. I hope you'll let it be that. Then, the last paragraph. I forgive your father for the ways he wasn't there. He is a man who loves the way he knows how, which is not always the way the people around him needed. And I spent 39 years learning the difference and deciding it was enough. You'll have to make your own decision about that. I only ask that you understand it was a real love, even when it was the wrong shape. Diane set the letter down. The kitchen held what it held. Caleb had not moved. Roy, near the doorway, was looking at the floor. Marion was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who has heard private things in professional contexts for 40 years and has learned to hold them carefully. Diane looked at me. "How long have you had this?" she said. "Since the week she passed," I said. She asked me to wait until it was time. Diane looked at the letter on the table, at her name in her mother's handwriting on the envelope, at Ruth's last pages, 3 of them, that had been waiting 4 years to arrive. "Was this the right time?" she said. I thought about that. "I think so," I said. I think she would have thought so. The room began to empty, the way rooms empty after something has been witnessed. Not quickly, not awkwardly. With the particular quiet courtesy of people who understand that they have been present for something private and are now making their exit with as little disturbance as possible. Roy squeezed my arm on his way to the front door and said he'd be at his place if I needed him. Connie Mueller covered the lasagna pan and left it on the counter without saying anything, which was its own kind of kindness. Don Brandt looked at Diane on his way out with the expression of a man who has revised his opinion of someone and wants her to know it, though he didn't say anything either. The Hartley kitchen, which had held 17 people and all their accumulated weight for the past several hours, contracted slowly back toward its ordinary size. Marion waited. When the room held only family Diane, Caleb, and Hank, who had come in from the yard and was standing near the door the way Hank always stood when he wasn't sure whether he was needed but didn't want to be far. Marion sat back down at the table. She had gathered her documents into their folders with the unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. And now she folded her hands and looked at Diane. "I need to talk to you about your position," she said. "Not tonight if you'd rather, but soon, before you speak to anyone else." Diane looked at her. She still had her mother's letter in her hands, folded back to its creases. "All right," she said. "Now is fine." Marion nodded. "What happened today involves you in ways that can't be undone. The power of attorney document had your signature on it. The affidavit confirming your father's incapacitation had your signature. Those are facts." She said this without judgment, the way doctors say things that need to be said plainly. What happens from here depends significantly on what you do next, and when. The simplest version is this. There is a cooperation agreement available to you. You provide truthful testimony about what you knew and when you knew it, and what Garrett told you about the fund and the transaction. You acknowledge responsibility for the documents you signed. In exchange, the county attorney and I've been in contact is prepared to consider a disposition that doesn't involve criminal prosecution, contingent on what you provide and how you provide it. Diane was quiet. "And if I don't cooperate," she said, "then you stand behind the documents with your signature on them and take whatever follows from that." Diane looked at the letter in her hands, at Ruth's handwriting visible at the fold. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "What happens to me?" she said, not afraid, just asking. I had asked myself this question in the hospital bed 3 weeks ago, lying in the dark listening to the monitor. I had asked it about Diane, and I had not known the answer. And I had spent the weeks since not knowing it, and carrying the not knowing the way you carry things that are too shapeless to put down cleanly. "I don't know," I said. "That's honest." She nodded.
She was, in that moment, more like her mother than I had ever seen her. The clarity of it, the absence of performance.
"What I can tell you," I said, "is what your mother would have said. And that's that the only way through something is through it. Not around, not under, through." Caleb, from where he was standing near the counter, said nothing. He was the kind of person who understood when speaking was not the thing. Diane looked at Marion. "Show me the agreement." Marion reached into her folder. The cooperation document was 4 pages. I had seen it before, had discussed it with Marion and with the county attorney over the course of the past 2 weeks. It said what it said. Diane read it the way she had read her mother's letter, steadily, without rushing, giving each page what it needed. She asked 2 questions. Marion answered them. Diane read the answers, considered them, and asked nothing else. Then she reached across the table for the pen. I had expected it to feel like something larger. I had expected some kind of culmination, a particular quality of silence, or a sound, or something in the light. It didn't feel that way. It felt like what it was, a person making a decision and committing it to paper. The way decisions get made when you've run out of alternatives to making them. She signed her name at the bottom of the 4th page, Diane Hartley Voss. The Hartley first, the way Ruth had always insisted on, even after the marriage. She set the pen down. She sat back in the chair that had been hers at this table since she was small enough that her feet hadn't reached the floor. And she looked at the signed document in front of her, and she breathed. "Done," she said. 1 word. But it carried everything in it that a single word can carry when it's the right one, said in the right room, at the end of the right day. The weight of what she'd been holding, the choice she'd just made, and underneath it, barely audible, something that might have been the first note of something other than anger. Caleb moved from the counter and sat down across from her. He reached across the table and picked up what was left of the coffee in the nearest cup and wrapped both hands around it. And he and his sister sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the way they had sat as children before the distance, before the years, before all the things that come between people who grow up in the same house, and then grow up. And neither of them spoke. And neither of them needed to. I stood at the counter and watched my children and thought about Ruth. Marion stayed long enough to leave her card and her next steps in writing, dates and contacts, and things to bring to the first meeting with the county attorney. She shook Diane's hand, then mine, then told Caleb it was good to finally meet him, which was the kind of thing you can say to someone without having met them, if you've heard enough about them from the people who love them. The door closed behind her. Hank Mueller, who had stationed himself near the back entry for the better part of the evening, with the unassuming permanence of a piece of load-bearing architecture, collected his coat from the hook and put it on, without anyone having to say anything to him. That was Hank. He'd been there when he was needed. Now he wasn't. And he knew it. And he left the way he came, without disturbance, without demanding acknowledgement for what he'd given. "Thank you, Hank," I said. "You call me if you need anything," he said. The door closed. And then it was just us. The kitchen that had held 17 people and 5 hours of accumulated truth held only us now. 3 people who had grown up in this house and scattered from it and arrived back tonight by routes none of us had planned. The refrigerator hummed. Ruth's cup was still on the table where I'd left it. Caleb was the one who spoke first. "She used to write to me," he said. He wasn't looking at either of us. He was looking at the table, at the pattern in the wood that had been in this kitchen since before any of us were born. Mom, after I left, the first couple of years when I was getting started up there and things were tight. He paused. She'd send letters, sometimes a check, not big, $100, sometimes two, with a note that said things like, "For a good coat for Montana winters," or "Put this toward whatever needs fixing." She told me not to tell anyone, said it was between us. Diane was very still. "I didn't know that," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "She knew you didn't know. She mentioned it once, near the end, when I was back to see her. Said she'd helped each of us in the ways she could, but that different people needed different things, and she'd tried to give everyone what she saw they needed rather than the same thing." He looked up at his sister. She saw a lot. Diane was quiet for a long moment. I could see her turning it over the way you turn something over when it's both easier and harder to understand than you expected. Ruth giving Caleb what Diane hadn't given him: support, connection, a thread back to the family, while Diane built her distance and her resentment. Ruth knowing all of it and loving everyone through it anyway, quietly, in the ways available to her. "She did," Diane said, finally. Not bitter, just acknowledging. She looked at the letter, still folded on the table in front of her. Then she pushed her chair back. "I'm going to Roy's," she said, "for tonight." She looked at me when she said it, and there was nothing in her face that I'd call a question. But there was something that was waiting, in the way that a statement can wait, without being a question. "That makes sense," I said. She went down the hall to the room that was still, technically, her room had been her room since she was born, was her room when she came to visit, had accumulated 30 years of her presence without any of us formally deciding it would. She came back with a bag that held one night's worth of things. She had not tried to take more than one night's worth. I walked her to the front door. She stopped in the doorway with her bag over her shoulder and the November air coming in cold around her. And she looked at me with the face that I had been reading for 41 years and could still not always translate correctly. "Diane," I said. She waited. "I'm sorry," I said. "For the summer you were 16. I've been sorry for a long time, but I should have said it a long time ago, and I didn't. And I'm saying it now." She looked at me. A long look. The kind that doesn't have a word attached to it, not forgiveness, not yet. And not refusal either. Something in between. Something that was perhaps the beginning of a road that we would have to walk without knowing where it ended. "I know," she said. And she went down the porch steps to her car. I stood in the doorway and watched her reverse down the lane. The headlights swept across the face of the barn, across the fence line, across the near edge of the east field where Hank had found me 3 weeks ago, face down in the cold dirt. The red taillights moved down the lane toward the county road, and then they were gone, and the dark closed back over the lane like water closing over a stone. Caleb came to stand beside me in the doorway. "She'll be all right," he said. "I know," I said. "Eventually." We stood there for a moment in the cold air. Then Caleb said, "I thought I might stay a few days, if that's okay." "It's more than okay," I said. We went out onto the porch without discussing it, the way you do things that don't require discussion. And we stood there in the dark and looked out at the fields. 160 acres of Iowa ground, still and frozen under November stars, holding everything that had ever been committed to it, and waiting, the way land waits, without impatience or judgment, for whatever came next. I was up before the light, the way I have been every morning of my adult life. That doesn't change. Whatever else changes, and a great deal had changed, the body keeps its routines. The pull toward morning, toward the first light and the quiet. That's the same as it's always been. I don't know if it's discipline or just the weight of 67 years of the same habit. Probably both. I put the kettle on. I took one mug from the cabinet, set it on the counter, stood there looking at it for a moment. Then I took Ruth's mug, the white one with the chipped handle, and set it beside mine. I don't know if I'll ever stop doing that. I've started to think that maybe I'm not supposed to. The coffee was ready by the time the eastern sky had gone from black to the deep indigo that comes just before dawn. The color the sky turns before it's made up its mind to commit to the day. I drank mine standing at the counter. I left Ruth's where it was. Caleb was asleep in his room. I could hear nothing from that end of the house, which meant he was sleeping deeply, which meant the drive from Montana had finally caught up with him, which was as it should be. He had driven 20 hours and walked into something that would have knocked a lesser person sideways. And he had stood steady through all of it. And he deserved the sleep. I put on my coat and my boots and went outside. The cold was real and immediate, the particular cold of Iowa in mid-November that doesn't negotiate. My breath showed in the air. The yard was still and dark, the barn a solid shape against a sky that was beginning, at its lowest edge, to show the first gray intimation of coming light. The east field spread out beyond the fence, flat and enormous and silent, the cut soybean stalks silvered with frost. I walked to the gate the way I had walked to it 10,000 times and went through. The field was hard underfoot, the ground frozen into a thin crust over the loam, that my boots broke through with each step, a sound I had been listening to since childhood. I walked toward the fence line steadily, not hurrying, watching the sky lighten above the tree line to the east. I stopped at the place where I had fallen. I knew it by the fence post, the one with the wire gone slack, that I'd been coming to check. The ground here was no different from the ground anywhere else in the field, but I knew it. A man knows the spot where his body failed him, even when the earth shows no record of it. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold through my coat, and the ache in my left side that the doctors said would improve, and had improved, incrementally, the way things improve when they've been genuinely damaged and not just inconvenienced. Then I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the ground. The cold came through my glove immediately, sharp and clean. The earth was solid, immovable, indifferent to what it had witnessed here 3 weeks ago and to what it would witness in the seasons ahead. It had been here before any of us, and would be here after all of us. And Ruth had understood that better than I ever had, which was why she had done what she did. Which was why the ground I was touching now would be here for Diane and Caleb and whoever came after them, if they chose to want it. I thought about Ruth. I do that every morning, so that was not different. But this morning, I thought about her with something I could only describe as gratitude that had nowhere to go, the particular ache of being grateful to someone you can no longer thank. She had seen what I could not see, had done what I could not do, had loved us all in the ways available to her, and left a letter for the one who most needed to hear it. And she had trusted me to wait until the right time. And I had. I thought about Diane, who had signed her name to something harder and longer than anything she'd faced, and who had said, "I know," in a doorway in the November dark. Not forgiveness, but something forgiveness could grow from if both of us tended it. I thought about Caleb, who had driven 20 hours and walked into a kitchen and said, "Am I late?"
and whose presence had felt like something the room had been missing for years without knowing it.
I thought about Roy, and Don Brandt, and Margaret Henderson, and all the people who had put their trust in a name and been taken advantage of. The law would do what the law does, slowly, and the money might not all come back. But they knew what had happened. They would not be alone in the knowing. The sky was fully gray now, the light spreading east to west in the slow way it spreads in Iowa in November, even and flat and enormous. A killdeer called from somewhere near the creek, the sound carrying in the cold air with unusual clarity. I pressed my palm a little harder against the ground, felt the cold, the solidity, the centuries of patient accumulation underneath my hand. The land remembers. My grandmother had said that. I had thought it was old woman talk. I no longer thought that. I stood up slowly, the way I stand up from anything now, carefully, with attention, with the understanding that the body is borrowed and not owned. I straightened to my full height. The day was beginning. There was work to do, and that was familiar. And familiar was, this morning, exactly enough. I turned and walked back toward the house, toward the lit kitchen window, toward the sound of Caleb beginning to stir, toward whatever came next. The frost cracked under my boots. The light kept coming. There's something I've learned about justice, as a man who spent 5 years building it. Justice is real. It matters. But it doesn't do what you think it will. It doesn't fill the empty chair. It doesn't repair what's broken between people. It doesn't bring back what the years quietly took while you were busy looking somewhere else. What I've come to understand is that justice is something you do for others. Peace is something you find for yourself. They're related, but they're not the same road. The real peace, the kind that stays, comes from being willing to look at your own part in what went wrong. Not just what was done to you, what you did or didn't do that opened the door for the damage to come in. That's the harder accounting, but it's the only one that actually settles the books. The land is still here. My daughter is walking her own road back. My son came home. And I am still standing in the field where I fell, learning what it means to tend something that outlasts you. That is the only legacy worth building.